Has someone ever taken credit for your work in the family?
At the barbecue, I stood there with a plate in my hand while everyone else raised their glasses. My dad clinked his beer to my sister Rachel's wine glass, and he went on about how proud he was of her new job title, how she had always been the one with ambition, how she was finally showing the world what our family was made of. Everyone cheered, everyone laughed, and it felt like the entire backyard had suddenly turned into Rachel's stage. No one looked at me, not even for a second. It wasn't as if I expected a speech in my honor, but you know that feeling when you realize not only are you invisible, you were never even supposed to be part of the show. That was me. I smiled, because what else was I supposed to do, frown in front of all of them? I smiled, stacked the used paper plates, and started clearing the table like I was the hired help. No one offered to help, no one even noticed. Rachel was glowing. Everyone kept going back for another toast, another story about her accomplishments. I could hear my uncle say she had the drive that runs in this family, and I almost laughed out loud because clearly he didn't mean me. And here's the thing, I could have sat there, swallowed it, gone home and cried about how unfair it was. That's what I used to do when I was younger. I used to tell myself that if I worked harder, if I tried to impress them, one day they'd see me. But that night I felt something shift inside me. I realized I wasn't sad. I was done. Done playing the quiet second daughter, the one who should clap and nod while Rachel soaks up every spotlight. Done pretending that their praise meant anything. Rachel looked across the table at one point and gave me that smirk she's perfected since high school. It was the kind of smirk that says, "I won again, and you'll never catch up." I almost thanked her for it, because that was the exact moment I knew I wasn't going to just sit back this time. When the food was finished and the plates were all dumped in the trash, I told Mom I was heading out early. She barely looked up. Dad waved his hand like I was a waitress leaving her shift. And Rachel? She didn't even pause in her story about some meeting she supposedly led at work. I got in my car and for the first time in years, I didn't cry. I wasn't hurt. I was planning. I started thinking back through all the years of being sidelined. All the family dinners where Rachel got the head of the table while I got whatever seat was left. The birthday parties where she got expensive gifts and I got something practical. The vacations where I ended up babysitting the younger cousins while Rachel went out with the adults. I remembered them all, and instead of letting the memories sting, I let them fuel me. Because I finally understood something: Rachel wasn't strong. She was propped up. And the higher they held her, the harder the fall would be when the truth came out. I had kept quiet for too long, but quiet doesn't mean blind. I had seen things, overheard things, things Rachel would never want repeated. And the beauty of it was, I didn't even need to invent anything. I just needed to remind the right people of what they had chosen to ignore. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I was calm. Almost too calm. I knew I wouldn't storm into the next family dinner demanding justice. I knew that wouldn't work. My parents don't respond to shouting. They respond to pressure, to shame, to anything that threatens the family image they've carefully built around Rachel. And I had exactly what could break that image. That night, I didn't scroll through social media like usual. I didn't call a friend to vent. I sat with a notebook and wrote down every secret, every inconsistency, every little thing Rachel had hidden behind her perfect smile. Her mounting credit card debt. Her rocky relationship with her boyfriend that she pretended was serious. The fact that her big promotion wasn't even a full promotion, it was a temporary fill-in until they hired someone else. I wrote it all out, not because I was going to throw it in her face tomorrow, but because I wanted it organized, ready. The next morning, I woke up to a string of photos Rachel had posted from the barbecue. Caption after caption about family pride and being surrounded by love. And in every picture, she looked flawless. The golden child. But I noticed something no one else did. Mom wasn't smiling in half of them. Dad's grin looked forced. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just me seeing what I wanted to see. But it gave me an idea. I decided I wasn't going to confront Rachel. That would be too easy for her. Instead, I was going to go straight to the one person she couldn't afford to lose, our mother. But here's the thing, if you're going to finally play your cards, you have to do it carefully. You can't throw everything on the table at once. You have to choose the one card that makes the others nervous. The one card that shakes their hand just enough that they know you're holding more. So when I called Mom later that week, I didn't rant about the barbecue. I didn't ask why she never defends me. I just said something very simple, something that I knew would stick in her mind and grow roots. And when I hung up, I didn't feel guilty. I felt like for the first time in my life, I had control of the story. That night, while Rachel was probably sipping wine and basking in the glow of her perfect little life, I was already watching the first crack appear. And I knew I wasn't going to stop until the whole golden statue came crashing down. The morning after the barbecue, I did not replay every petty comment in my head, and I did not pick fights with people who would never admit they were wrong anyway. Because I had already decided that if I wanted anything to change, I would have to change my approach first. So I made coffee, opened my old notes app where I keep the kind of details you think you will never need, and I started building a clear list of the little moments that proved what I had always felt but never used, which was that Rachel's shine came from the spotlight our parents kept aimed at her, not from anything steady inside her that could stand on its own when the room got dark. I wrote down the weekend last spring when she called me whispering from her car because the minimums on 2 cards were due and she did not want to tell our parents. And I remembered how I sat with her at my kitchen table and walked her through a balance transfer while she kept saying this was only temporary and that the promotion was coming any day. And I wrote down the way she swore me to secrecy even though I had not asked to be part of the secret in the first place. I wrote down the week she asked me to edit her resume because her boss had mentioned bringing in an outside hire and she wanted to look competitive, just in case, which already told me more than she meant to say. I wrote down the night she cried in my living room about her boyfriend threatening to move out if she did not stop lying about working late when she was actually at happy hours hosted by vendors. The kind of thing that sounds harmless until you realize she was using his patience like an overdraft fee. When you put those moments side by side, you see a pattern that is impossible to ignore, and once you see the pattern, you cannot pretend that the one who keeps winning is also the one who tells the truth. So I added a few public breadcrumbs to my list in case anyone tried to claim this was just sisterly jealousy, like the company announcement that used the word interim next to her title, even though she had told our parents it was permanent, and the careers page where the exact role was still open for applications, and the realtor email she forwarded to me with a smiley face asking if I could review the numbers quickly because she wanted to put in an offer on a condo while somehow also pretending the down payment would appear from thin air. I was not angry while I did this, which surprised me because anger used to be my default. But this time I felt something calmer and much colder that allowed me to look at Rachel the way a grown woman finally looks at the family story she has been handed since childhood, and the practical conclusion I reached was simple. If you build a pedestal out of denial, the kindest thing you can do for everyone is to stop pretending it is marble. So I did not call her, and I did not accuse her, and I did not make a scene, because that would have let her play the victim, and I was not going to give her that power, and instead I waited for the weekly family lunch that our mother treats like a holiday. And I showed up with dessert, sat in my usual chair, listened to the same old compliments being shoveled onto Rachel's plate like gravy, and when there was a pause I leaned forward with what anyone watching would have called a supportive smile. And I asked how the interim title was going and whether the company had already posted the permanent role or if they were waiting for internal candidates to meet with the hiring panel first, since that can be nerve-wracking, and I was happy to run a mock interview if she wanted to practice. The room did not go silent in some dramatic movie way, which I never expect from my family because they are experts at pretending, but a very precise kind of quiet settled under the chatter. The kind you hear when people are trying to process a detail that does not match the story they agreed to, and I watched my father glance sideways at my mother, and I watched my mother's fork stop halfway to her mouth, and I watched Rachel's expression freeze into something polished that had been rehearsed for years, but still could not cover the small stiffening in her jaw that only someone who knows her as well as I do would notice. She said it was nothing. She said the word interim was a formality. She said the posting was a routine compliance thing. She said everyone knew she was already doing the job, and she tried to laugh in that breezy way that usually melts the room. But the laugh sounded thin even to her, so I kept my voice warm and appreciative, and I said that was wonderful and that it made sense for the company to keep things open on paper for transparency, and I added that if she wanted I could connect her with A recruiter friend who has coached many people through the exact situation of holding an interim role while the permanent posting stays up, because there are little tactics that help, like gathering measurable wins and making sure references are aligned with the hiring timeline. And I said it all in that helpful big sister tone she hates because it puts her on the back foot without a single insult. My mother asked where I had heard that the job was posted, which told me she had not been told, and that she had already built a mental scrapbook labeled Rachel's promotion that would now need a fresh page. And I said it was public on the company site and that I had stumbled on it while reading an article about layoffs in the industry, which was true and also useful, and my father mumbled something about how companies do strange things these days, while Rachel pushed food around her plate and said she did not want to talk shop during family time and launched into a story about a team offsite that sounded like a brochure. I did not press, I did not dig, I did not deliver the knockout, because I wanted them to sit with the mild discomfort of a story that no longer fit perfectly, and when lunch wound down my mother asked me to stay a few minutes to help with dishes, which she has never asked of me unless she also wanted privacy, and she stood next to me at the sink and asked whether I thought Rachel was under more pressure than she let on, and I said that pressure always shows up in the cracks first and that maybe it would help to check in on the practical side of things like budgets and timelines rather than only cheering the headlines, and I let the words hang there without pointing to the list I had made, because I wanted her to ask for it rather than feel that I had pushed it at her. On my way home, I forwarded my mother a link to the public job posting with a quick note that said this might explain why Rachel seems short-tempered lately, and that she would probably prefer support that sounds like planning rather than praise that sounds like expectation, which is a difference parents often miss, and I put my phone face down on the passenger seat and let the quiet settle, because the first move had landed exactly where I wanted it to land. By dinner time, my phone lit up with a message from my mother asking if we could talk alone the next day, and I could imagine Rachel pacing in her apartment trying to calculate how much I had said and to whom. And I decided I would not answer any of her calls that night, because sometimes the most effective truth is the kind that arrives without the courtesy of a warning. When my mother asked if we could talk alone, I knew it was not about recipes or scheduling, because her voice carried that tight patience she uses when she has already tried to convince herself that everything is fine and the effort has worn thin. So I drove over with the list I had made and the link to the posting sitting in an email draft, and I told myself that if I wanted anything to change, I would have to be specific, calm, and impossible to dismiss, which meant no accusations, no shouting, and no leaving room for anyone to label this as jealousy dressed up as concern. I started with gratitude that probably sounded strange in the moment, because I thanked her for being the one who always kept the family moving when the men ran out of patience and the children ran out of good behavior. And then I added that sometimes the person who keeps everything moving forgets to ask whether the direction still makes sense, and she gave me that cautious look that says she is listening even as she prepares to defend Rachel. Which is exactly why I opened my phone and showed her the public job posting that used the word interim next to the title everyone had toasted, and I told her I did not care about titles, but I did care about honesty. Because honesty is the only thing that stops a family from confusing performance with reality. She tried to explain it away, and I let her, because explanations are a form of goodbye to the story you loved, and when she finished I put my printed list on the table and walked her through it the way you walk someone you love through a room without turning on the light. Not to scare her, but to help her feel the furniture before she hits it, so I reminded her of the balance transfer Rachel did at my kitchen table while asking me not to tell, and the realtor email begging for a quick review of numbers that did not exist, and the late night crying about a boyfriend who was tired of being treated like a placeholder, and I kept my voice steady because this was not gossip. This was a pattern that had been protected by a very expensive kind of faith. My mother asked whether I was saying Rachel is a liar, and I said I was saying Rachel is afraid, and that fear makes her embellish, and the embellishment forces everyone else into roles they did not agree to, which is why Dad becomes the loud cheerleader, why Mom becomes the quiet banker, and why I become the audience who is expected to clap on cue. And I told her I was done clapping, not because I hate my sister, but because I want my mother to stop using her retirement as a safety net for Rachel's image management. I offered something practical because practical is the language my mother trusts, so I suggested that before any more gifts or emergency deposits or co-signing fantasies, she tell Rachel that adult help requires adult transparency, and that the next conversation should include pay statements, credit balances, and a written plan that explains timelines and contingencies rather than captions and hashtags. And I said that if she wanted, I would sit quietly in the corner and keep the notes so there could be no misunderstanding later, but that I would not carry one more secret on my back, because secrets are how this whole game stays alive. She put her hands over her face and cried the kind of tears that do not scream or demand attention, the kind that are mostly relief mixed with shame, and she asked me why I had not told her sooner, and I said, because sooner you were still in love with the story. And because sooner I did not trust myself to say it without trying to win, and today I am not trying to win, I am trying to stop the bleeding before you hand over one more piece of yourself to a problem that grows every time you feed it. When she finally breathed again, she asked me what she should say, and I told her to keep it short and clean, to say that until the permanent offer is in writing and the numbers are on the table, there will be no more deposits, no more quiet loans, no more backdoor fixes, and that we love her and we will help her plan, but we will not help her pretend. And my mother nodded like someone who has just set down a box she did not realize was breaking her spine, and she asked me to type the message for her because she did not trust her hands. I wrote it out in plain words that could not be twisted into a different meaning. She pressed send, and the little family machine that has hummed on praise and denial for years made a sound I have never heard before. A kind of stall that felt both terrifying and necessary, and I kissed her cheek, told her to take a bath and turn off her phone, and I left before I could soften anything, because the timing mattered more than my comfort. That night my phone buzzed with the message I had been expecting from the moment I showed my mother the posting, a single line from Rachel that read, "What did you say to Mom? She's in tears," and I looked at the screen for a long time without answering, because for the first time in years the question did not belong to me anymore, and the silence served my point better than any explanation ever could. Rachel called 3 times and left a voicemail that tried to sound calm and grown, yet underneath the measured words I could hear that tight edge she always gets when the room stops clapping on cue. And I did not return the calls because I had finally learned that answering immediately only trains people to believe they can set the tempo of your life. So I waited until evening and sent a short text that said I was with Mom earlier and that she wanted plans, not applause, and that when Rachel felt ready to talk numbers with Mom, we could all sit down like adults and map the next quarter, which was the most practical sentence I could come up with that also made it clear the old dance was over. Before she could spin that into another performance, I drove to my parents' place with a legal pad, 2 pens, and a calm voice. And I sat at the kitchen table with my mother while my father paced and muttered about how businesses are heartless and how loyalty used to mean something. So I let him vent for a while, and then I laid out a simple structure I knew they would understand, which was that any help to either daughter from now on would follow the same rules regardless of who was crying or who was being toasted, and that the rules would be boring on purpose because boring is what saves families from expensive stories, and the rules were not complicated at all. No deposits without written budgets, no co-signing without a repayment schedule in black and white, no floating balances on personal cards, no, we will figure it out later, when later always arrives with interest. My mother looked relieved and my father looked offended, and I reminded him that fairness is not an insult to love. It is the thing that keeps love from turning into a tab, and then my mother did the small brave thing that changes everything, which was to call her bank while I sat there and remove Rachel as an authorized user on the catch-all card that has quietly covered overdrafts and emergencies that never end, and she also opened a new savings account in her name only with no linked transfers and wrote down the credentials in a notebook that will not leave the house, and I watched my father stop pacing when he realized we were not punishing anyone, we were simply refusing to feed a story that had turned us into extras. With that done, I drafted a message for the family group text that my mother later pressed send on without shaking, a plain statement that said going forward any family help will be tied to a plan that includes documents, that the same standard applies to both daughters, and that the goal is to support grown decisions rather than fund panic. And the moment the message delivered, the quiet in our house changed temperature, because for the first time my parents had placed both of us on the same ground, and on that ground Rachel would have to stand without the usual cushion. The responses arrived in order, and every one of them told me what I needed to know. My aunt sent a thumbs up, which I translated as I have thought this for years. My father sent a second message 2 minutes later that sounded like a toast to fairness, because he wanted it on record that he supported his wife. And Rachel sent a long paragraph about how she felt blindsided and unsupported, and how this was a terrible week for dramatic changes, and I replied with a single sentence that said planning is not drama, and that we would all help her plan as soon as she brings what Mom asked for, which is an offer letter, a budget, and the numbers. When she called again, I picked up, not to fight, but to remove the usual exits, so I listened without interrupting while she accused me of turning Mom against her and of stalking her company's career page like some jealous teenager. And when she ran out of steam, I said the only sentence that mattered, which was that I am not against her and I am not for her. I am for the truth that lets Mom sleep, and that if Rachel wants a cheer squad, she can hire one, but if she wants help, she will need to stop treating the people paying the bills like background noise. And I could hear her swallow hard, because I had never said it like that before. She tried to pivot into soft pleading about the condo timeline and asked whether I could convince Mom to float the down payment just until the promotion was formal, and I said no, and I said it without apology. And then I made the offer that felt like holding a mirror to her face, which was to spend a Saturday morning building a real budget that could be shown to any banker or hiring manager without embarrassment. And I added that I already had a simple template ready because I do not show up empty-handed anymore, and I also told her that during that session I would expect her to correct the resume bullets I had once rewritten at her request, the ones that quietly turned assisting into leading. Because if we are cleaning house, we should clean it for real. There was silence, then the clipped little laugh she uses right before she chooses fight over truth, and she said I was threatening her, and I said I was not threatening, I was clarifying, and that the difference is that threats are about fear while clarity is about boundaries. And this is a boundary she has not met before, and then I told her we would all meet at our parents' on Sunday with documents and coffee and the understanding that no one leaves until there is a plan, which is what grown families do when they are done playing court. After we hung up, I sent my mother a separate text with the exact list of items to request so there could be no last-minute fog, and I asked my father to print 2 copies of the group message and tape one inside the hall closet where the tax files live, because I wanted a physical reminder in the house that the rules changed. And then I set my phone down and realized that the relief I felt was not about winning an argument. It was about finally cutting the fuel line that kept one person's image burning while the rest of us stood around wiping smoke from our eyes. Sunday will either be a clean start or a bonfire, and I am fine with either outcome, because I have one more card that I have not played and do not want to play, a simple piece of truth that sits in my folder and does not move. And the only condition under which it will ever see daylight is if Rachel tries to turn my silence into her cover one more time, which means when she walks in on Sunday with or without papers, the balance will shift either way. Sunday began with the kind of careful quiet that tells you everyone has rehearsed their version of the day. And when Rachel walked in holding a tote and a bright smile that did not reach her eyes, I understood we were about to test whether our new rules were real or just another performance. So I kept my voice even and my posture open while my mother laid out the legal pad and the coffee and asked for the documents we had all agreed to bring, and Rachel launched into a soft speech about timing and stress and how this week had been unusually complicated, which sounded like every week we have ever given away. And when my mother did not blink or backpedal, Rachel set the tote down without unzipping it and said that if we loved her we would trust her. And my father cleared his throat as if he might rescue her out of habit until he looked at my mother's hands and saw that they were steady for the first time in years. I let the silence do the work for a full minute because silence is a tool I had never learned to use growing up in a family where the loudest person always won. And then I slid the simple worksheet I had made across the table and said we could start with estimates if the exact statements were not available, and that we could fill in the real numbers when the documents arrived. And I said it with enough warmth that no one could call it an attack, yet with enough firmness that no one could mistake it for a suggestion, and to her credit Rachel sat down and wrote a few figures that belonged to a fantasy novel rather than a budget, at which point my mother asked in that quiet voice she reserves for truth whether the promotion had a contract date yet. And Rachel said soon, and my father asked whether the condo required proof of funds, and Rachel said it did, but the lender was flexible because her name carried weight in the market, and I felt the old frustration rise like heat until I remembered that I was not here to be right, I was here to be effective. So I told her I had spoken to a lender myself, not her lender and not in her name, but a neutral professional who explained how gift letters work and how underwriters call the givers to confirm that the money is not a loan in disguise. And I turned to my mother and said that if she did not want that phone call, she needed to decide today whether any gift existed, because pretense would soon be impossible, and my mother nodded and said she would not sign any letter until the job was permanent and the debts were visible and the plan was real, and Rachel's smile cracked in a way I have only seen a handful of times, and she accused me of poisoning the well, and I said that wells only turn if something is already in the water. The argument she expected did not arrive because I refused to give her the energy she came for, and instead I said there was one last thing we needed to clear before we could move at all. And I looked at my father first, because I wanted him to hear this like a man who protects his house, and I told them both that a while back Rachel had asked me to confirm to a mortgage officer that she had paid back a private loan from our parents, which did not exist, and that she had offered to send me a script so I would not stumble on the details, and I told them I had recorded the call where she admitted this, not to trap her but to protect myself in case she later claimed I had misrepresented anything. And I said that the recording would never be played in this room or any other as long as we all agreed to stop treating truth like a negotiable product, and the room went very still because nothing hits a family harder than hearing their own reflexes out loud. Rachel said I was blackmailing her, and I told her I was drawing a line that should have been drawn years ago. And I added that the recording would stay in a locked folder unless she tried to turn silence into cover again by telling people that I had pushed her into bad decisions or lied to get attention. Because if she went that route, I would protect myself and our mother with facts. And there was a tremor in her jaw, and for a second I saw the kid who learned early that applause could erase mistakes, and I let the feeling pass without rescuing her because the rescue would only reset the game. My mother reached across the table and placed her hand over mine the way she does when she is about to choose the harder thing, and she said she wanted the same standard for both daughters and the same love for both daughters. And that from this day there would be no money without paper, no promises without proof, and no more secrets traded like gifts at the end of every crisis. And my father finally exhaled and said he would back that plan and that he expected respect in this house when rules were being followed. And Rachel stood up then and said she needed air and that all of this was too much and that none of us understood the pressure she was under. And I said we did not understand because pressure shared through lies is not pressure, it is manipulation. And if she wanted us to understand, she could start by handing my mother access to the actual accounts, which she declined to do, and that answer did the work I needed. She left with the tote, and there was no chase and no apology and no dramatic collapse, just my mother deleting a set of automatic transfers she had set up years ago because she had believed that cushioning Rachel was the same as loving her. And my father taping our new family rules inside the cabinet with the tax folders, and me emailing a blank copy of the budget sheet to Rachel with a line that said the offer to help build a real plan stands whenever you want to stop performing, and within an hour my phone buzzed with a message from her that said we need to talk and a second message that said what did you say to mom that made her cry like that? And I finally answered her with the only sentence that matters and the one I had been waiting to say since the moment I smiled at the barbecue and cleared the table like an extra, which was that I told Mom the truth. And that from now on the truth would not depend on who was holding the glass.